But so my name's Andrea. I work for Bexley Council in the waste and recycling team, and my job is to talk to people about waste minimisation and waste and recycling in general. And in my hunt for things to enhance my knowledge on, particularly about food waste, I came across Kate. And Kate is all about freezing food. Now, I thought I've been doing food waste and talking about food waste for an awful long time, like too many years to say, really. And I thought there's nothing that anyone can show me, you know, that I don't know already. But I was wrong, and Kate does know more than me, just.
I'm a freezer geek.
No, she is the freezer geek. And so I found Kate's thing, and I tried her freezer challenge. And just to introduce the concept, so I tried the freezer challenge, which can be found on the Bexley Council website and on the Bexley Ecofestival website, and cleared out, rejigged my freezer, according to what Kate suggested. And my family opened the freezer door and shouted across the house, "Oh my God, what has happened to our freezer?" and was truly impressed. Now, you know, that takes quite a lot to do that, have that impact. So that is why I have, we wanted Kate to come along today and how the relationship started. So over to Kate.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you today, and thank you so much for joining us, about your freezer and how useful it can be when it comes to food waste and saving money and taking some of the stress out of cooking and having to, you know, continue to feed whether it's yourself or a family. We all struggle with food waste. Most people, you know, some people are very, very good at keeping it minimal, but there are always those things that always seem to slip through the net. In the UK, we waste about 4.7 million tonnes of food every single year. That's about enough to fill 95 Royal Albert Halls. Now, to give you some idea of scale as well, like, we waste about a third of all the food that's produced. And the reason this is important is obviously it's very frustrating, but also when we waste food, we're not just wasting the food. You think about, you know, everybody's had this, right? Everybody's had a bunch of bananas on the side, a little bit past it, and they head towards the food waste bin most likely if there's somebody that won't eat them when they're brown. We're not just throwing away the bananas. We're throwing away the water, the land, the energy, all of the blood, sweat and tears, the hard work that somebody has put into producing them, and the packaging and the transportation. Now, I'm not saying this to guilt trip anybody, because I have been there. I have wasted more than my fair share of bananas and everything else. But this is costing the planet, and it's costing us. The average family of 4 wastes about £1,000 a year throwing away food that could have been eaten. So this is something that if we can bit by bit start to tackle, start to reduce, then we're doing something good for the planet, but we're also going to benefit ourselves financially. So it's something well worth tackling. Now, when it comes to food waste, freezing is the main thing that I obviously do. And the reason that I'm so passionate about freezing, I got into batch cooking when I was in my 20s. I was very ill, had blood clots in my shoulders, and my mum came and filled a little freezer for me, and put me on the path of using my freezer in this way to make life a little bit less stressful. When I got to the point of having my second child, I just hit a wall. It just was not happening anymore. So, you know, I would buy that food with good intentions in the way that we all do. You know, you buy the fruits and the vegetables, you want to feed your kids well, you want to feed yourself well, and usually at least some of it's going to end up going in the bin. So what I discovered, pairing together my knowledge of batch cooking with the frustration that I was suffering with food waste. And if I'm totally honest, when I first started, it was mostly about the financial. It wasn't really about the environmental impact. I had no idea about the impact it was having. That realisation that actually if I could freeze a meal that I'd cooked, actually, surely I could freeze the individual ingredients. And just being able to press pause on those individual ingredients can really, really help to just ease the pressure, basically, and make it easier for you to have whatever ingredients you want in the house without them going to waste and without you wasting the money as well.
That's great. And what are the different ways that we can freeze food then?
So there are 3 techniques I tend to use, which I'm going to have Andrea demo with us today. What I would say is there are a lot of different types of foods we can freeze.
Yes.
We're down on the Bexley stall, so if you haven't already been past, pop down. We've got a display of food to just demonstrate some of the things that you might not have thought about. So Yeah, I'm not going to give it away because there's one thing on the table that you can't freeze, so do come and play the game. But, you know, your fruits, your vegetables, if you're using tins of things, you can usually freeze the other half. So if you are guilty, as I have been, of opening a jar of something and putting it, you know, in the door of the fridge and coming to it and it's growing mold on it, or if you've opened a can of something and you put it in the fridge and you think, oh, use that at some point, and then a week later you realise you haven't and it ends up in the bin. Instead, you could be pressing pause on those foods, getting them in the freezer instead. So the key thing when you're doing this is to think about how you're going to want to use the food after. Usually people will say, well, I can't freeze that because when I defrost it, surely it's going to be disgusting. Most stuff does not need to be defrosted. I always defrost raw meat because you want to make sure that you're cooking it through thoroughly and not overcooking it. But most other stuff can actually be cooked straight from frozen as long as you're cooking it through till it's piping hot, or you're just eating it straight from frozen, which is some of the things we're going to demo here. So a technique that you can use to avoid all the food clumping up together is open freezing. So you can just freeze a banana if you wanted to. You could just stick an entire banana into the freezer, but it's going to turn black. It's going to look very unappealing when you thaw it, and there's not many ways that you're going to want to use it after. You could use it in baking and things, but it's not going to be very easy for you to use on a whim just when you fancy it. So instead, if you grab your bananas, it takes 2 minutes to do, slice them up and pop them onto a tray. Now I've got freezer trays that I use that are stackable, but you can literally just use whatever's around the house. So if you've got like Tupperware lids or baking trays, anything that's flat, even things like picnic plates, just remember if they don't have a side on it and you're putting it in a freezer that's like that, which is what I tend to do, I've got an ice box, remember what's on it, because I have brought stuff out the freezer before and it's like blueberries and I just get a raining of blueberries on me. So if you've not got sides on it, just be careful. Also,
what is this for?
This, always line the tray. So if you put that banana onto this tray as it is going to fuse onto it and you're going to have to defrost it to get it off the tray. So this is reusable baking parchment. We have got some, I think as part of the raffle prize.
We do, yes, it's in the...
on the Bexley stand, so you can come down and take a look at it there if you'd like to after. But the reason for doing this is that when you open freeze before you put into a freezer bag, those pieces of food are going to freeze individually, so they're going to freeze faster, so it's going to better retain the quality because the ice crystals are smaller, but also they're not going to all clump together. So we've obviously done it with the sliced banana, but also if you've got things like berries, make sure you give them a wash first and let them dry off on some kitchen towel or something, or a clean tea towel. But if you spread them out on the tray, that fact that they're freezing individually just retains the quality so much better, but it also means when you want to use them, you can just use as much as you want and as much as you need. So you could just take, if you've cut up that entire bunch of bananas and actually you just want 3 pieces to put in a smoothie that you're making, you can just grab 3 pieces. You don't have to start hacking at the food in the bag or whacking it on the counter or defrosting the whole lot in order to be able to use what you actually need. So doing this before you move it into a container or a freezer bag, whatever you prefer to use, would just give you so much more flexibility when you actually want to use those items.
What can we do with them afterwards?
So,
I've got lots of ideas.
Yeah, the key thing with these, as I've sort of alluded to, is that you don't want to necessarily be defrosting these particular items. So you could defrost berries and things to use in cooking, in baking, but generally speaking, you're wanting to use them from frozen. So frozen bananas, dip them in a little bit of dark chocolate and keep them in the freezer. They taste like healthier choc ices, basically. They're really tasty. You can pop them in a blender, whiz them up into ice cream for the kids. It's really tasty. You can add different flavours to it as well, so things like peanut butter or chocolate spread, different berries and stuff. And also, you can just snack. So like the berries, if you pop them into the freezer, they're really nice straight from frozen. So literally just snacking on frozen berries. Just be careful if you're giving them to kids, obviously, for choking hazards.
Yes.
But you can just use them like that, use them in baking as well. So it's a really accessible, easy way. It's just that whole thing of you're not going to be able to defrost them and eat them as you would as if they were fresh.
And they don't last very long, do they, berries? So it's a really good way of pressing pause.
Yeah. I find that now, you get a delivery or you go to the shop, and by the time you've got them home, you're already, questioning whether half of the pack are actually edible anymore. So being able to freeze them is just a really handy method.
And what about liquid type foods?
Yeah, so the second technique is flat freezing, which is basically with anything wet, instead of freezing it in tubs, if you freeze it flat in freezer bags, and we've got one here, we did a demo earlier, so we've already had a pour. Obviously, you wouldn't just freeze half a tin of tinned tomatoes for the sake of it, but if you've got half a tin of something left, so tomatoes, maybe coconut milk, if you've done batch cooking as well, this is really useful. So if you've got things like bolognese or chili, instead of putting it in a tub, which is going to take up a lot of space and is going to take more time to defrost, if you put it into a freezer bag like that, pop it onto like your surface.
I'll just squeeze it shut first.
Try not to get it all over.
A second, sorry.
I'll pop that there for you. And basically, if you squeeze it as flat as possible, pop that into the freezer, then you're going to have a very thin package that's frozen solid. It's going to take up very little space in the freezer, but more importantly, it's going to be more accessible when you want to use it. So if you want to cook some chili, some bolognese, a curry, whatever it might be, using your ingredient, you can literally just run that under the cold tap, or if it's thin enough, even just break off a piece and put it straight into the pan. As long as you're cooking till it's piping hot, that's absolutely fine to do. If you've got something that you've frozen like that, which isn't a food that you are going to be cooking in the way of like tomatoes. So if, for example, you'd frozen something like eggs, so you can freeze eggs, not in the shell, but whisk them up, pop them into a freezer bag like that, make sure you mark how many eggs there are. You'd obviously want to defrost those fully, so you could use them for baking or omelettes, frittatas, whatever it might be. So you're going to need them fully defrosted. So if you put those flat frozen eggs into a dish of cold water, they will defrost in about 10-15 minutes. So instead of having that thing of having to plan ahead, that you're going to get that food out in advance to make sure that it's defrosted to be able to use it, you can pretty much just use it straight from frozen or defrost it very quickly.
This is a really good technique as well. So when you do have liquids and you've got a bag, like sometimes you're sort of trying to hold the bag open and pour the stuff in and it drips all over. Any glass, but a wider necked one is better. With the bag inside, you just fold over the edges, and then you've got like a sort of a clear surface so that when you come to seal it, it's not covered in liquid. So I found that a top tip as well. That's very useful. And the other thing I noticed you put on here is a label.
Yes, really important to label things, particularly if you are somebody who likes batch cooking or freezing leftovers. I think we always think we're going to remember what it is.
Yeah.
I get a lot of people saying, yeah, we have to play freezer roulette. Like I think the worst one that I've come across was a fellow content creator who had basically got what she thought was butternut squash out of the freezer, heated it up, turned out it was mango sorbet.
I've had exactly the same thing the opposite way around, promising my children that they could have some ice cream.
Oh no.
And then I heard what are the orange bits? And it was a casserole.
No.
And they did not forgive me for quite a long time.
Yeah, so definitely label, and putting the date on as well, just as a prompt to remind you, like how long's it been in the freezer. Things don't technically go off in the freezer, but the quality is going to massively reduce the longer that things are frozen for. So really, you want to aim for sort of using things within 3 to 6 months, quicker if it's something small or thin like ham that's going to become freezer burnt quite quickly. But if you package things well, then actually they can last quite a while. It's not a safety issue, it's a quality issue.
And it's quite useful sometimes to write down the portion size as well. So if it's 1 adult, 1 child, 2 children, sometimes depending on how you might want to eat it in the future, and then what you're going to get at the end.
Yeah, and I'd say with that, from my batch cooking days, a really handy hack if you are freezing leftovers or batch cooking, the portion sizes that you freeze, like the first one that you freeze, get the dish out, think about the person, because I've had this before where I, in the very early days, would just get a ladle and just put a ladle in each bag or 2 ladles in each bag or whatever it was. And then it would always be too much for me and not enough for my husband. And that thing of actually getting the plate out and going, right, what portion size would I actually want? These are my portions, these are my husband's portions, these are the kids' portions if we've got little leftovers of things. If you want to freeze in a family bag, obviously you can do that, but it's just thinking about, okay, actually get the bowl that you're going to use and essentially dish up the first one. And if you do that on a set of weighing scales, then you'll know how much
Yeah.
it weighs, and then in future you can just weigh out the portions and not have to do the measuring on the plate.
But this was the eureka moment for me. So after following Kate's, is it the full freezer challenge?
The freezer clear down
The freezer
challenge.
clear down challenge,
Yeah.
and sort of sorting out my freezer once and for all, which is still 2 years later, I think, still in good condition, still showing like the techniques of it, is to, you know, coming from a waste perspective, I always didn't really want to use plastic bags, but actually, if you, the way that you do this is you can reuse these bags again and again. You just rinse them out and dry them off, and you can use them. And if you are using them for raw meat or fish, you can just write, you know, I write big raw on them, and then I know not to use them for anything other than raw meat and fish. But you know, this is key really, because like you were saying in the other talk, everybody's got space to put this in their freezer, even if you've got one of those tiny little freezers. And then you almost like sort of stack them up, don't you, like a filofax system, and then you can sort of flick through, and you know, you can store 20 of these if you really wanted to, and they take up that much space rather than 20 boxes that stack on top, and then you know, you've got no space.
Yeah, and another hack with it when you're labelling the bags is to label across the top
Yeah.
of the bag, rather than, you know, you sort of get the box in the middle of a lot of bags to label what it is. But if you write it across the top and then you set it up almost like a filofax kind of system or a filing cabinet, you can flick through the top. You don't have to pick everything out to find what you're looking for. You can just flick through, pull it out, and then, as you say, when you've got to the point, you know, if you're freezing things like the bananas or raspberries, I put those in a freezer bag and I just refill that bag. Like, if it gets to a point where I've fully emptied it, then I might, as you say, you know, you wash it out, turn it fully inside out. The bags that I get, you can put them on a tea towel and just turn them fully inside out. They've got a nice thick band across them, and that just makes it so much easier for you to actually make sure you are reusing them, because there's no need for them to be single use.
No, absolutely. You can use them multiple times.
Yeah.
And why have I got an ice cream tray?
So the final technique is cube freezing, and this is for those things that you usually just need a tablespoon of. And you know, when you, that tendency to open a jar of pesto or curry paste or whatever it might be. I think there was a lady saying about, you know, mint sauce. Those jars that end up in the fridge and they just live there, taking up space and eventually growing mould. Instead, you can decant them into an ice cube tray. So if you've got a tablespoon, I know that mine's, we've got some pesto there, which was one. Did I do it up today? So that was one that always used to go off in our house. I'd always think, oh, we've got ages, we've got like 2 or 3 weeks, it'll be fine. And it would always go beyond it. Even if I wrote on it, I'd usually write on it with a Sharpie when I actually opened it, so I at least knew. But now, as soon as I open a jar, I will freeze the rest of the jar into cubes, and then once they're frozen solid, they can go into a freezer bag or into a tub, and they can be used straight from frozen. So if I'm doing something like pesto pasta for the kids, I can just grab out as much as I need, as many cubes as I need, and just heat them through in a pan or defrost them in the microwave, and cook with them straight away. And that way, the jars just never end up going to waste. And the space is...
Sorry.
Pardon?
No, sorry, I interrupted. carry on.
And the space is freed up in the fridge as well, which I find is really helpful. That if you use your freezer as an extension of the fridge, rather than thinking of it as long-term storage, actually just buying, even if it just buys you a couple extra days so that things don't end up in the bin, because obviously we know there are certain products that have best before dates, and we can, you know, use our senses to make sure that, you know, they're not going to make us sick. But if there are products with use by dates, it's really important that we follow them for our safety. So using the freezer is a really effective way to just press pause on those foods, so that we don't put our family's health at risk, and we can make sure that nothing's ending up in the bin, basically.
They're great for storing herbs and things like that, and garlic, crushed garlic, and chilli. I did it with chilli because I have, like, you know, you get 3 in a pack and I only need half a chilli or something. So cut it all up small, put a little bit for chilli into each one, and then you cook straight. And you're right, cooking straight from frozen is better than leaving it on the side. Then it goes soggy, and then you try and cook with it, and it never really works out well, does it? So, but yeah, cooking straight from frozen really works.
It is really important, though, with the ice cube trays, if you're putting food in them, obviously, if you like having ice in your drinks, have a separate one, because it will stain the ice cube trays and it will take on the smell and everything. Personally, I don't use ice anymore. I just freeze fruit for my drinks. So things like slices of lemon, slices of lime, grapefruit, like we just use frozen fruit in our drinks now. I don't have ice in my freezer at all. So that's how I kind of get around not needing extra ice cube trays. But yeah, everything is very much use it from frozen, and alternatively making sure that you freeze it in a way that it's going to defrost quickly. So like the flat freezing works with things like your tinned tomatoes, or like, you know, half jars of things. Things like dairy products as well, so cream, milk you could flat freeze as well instead of freezing in big containers, so it defrosts faster. But also things like meat. So if you want to buy a big pack of minced meat, you know, buy the bulk pack and then separate it up into smaller quantities, and then you can freeze those flat in the bag. They'll defrost a lot quicker, and you can get dinner on the table much faster. So it's just that thinking, you know, taking 5 minutes before it goes in the freezer to make your life a lot easier at the other end of the process.
That's great. I don't know if there are any questions. So I know, yes.
Bananas.
Yeah.
Are they eatable to make it like a fruit cocktail to eat it?
I personally wouldn't make a fruit cocktail with them, because they are going to be very watery if you defrost them. You could eat them partially frozen within the cocktail, but I wouldn't if you were in the freezer. If the longer they're in the freezer for, the more they will discolour. But if you use them within a month or two, they're generally fine.
What about grapes? Can you freeze grapes?
Yes, you can, and I wouldn't defrost them. So I would eat them. You can eat them frozen. They're like little sorbets.
Yes, live by myself, so you buy fruit, like an extra fruit, and you think, well, you've got to force yourself to eat it, or it's going to go off.
Yeah, no, strawberries, raspberries, grapes, blueberries, everything, and just eating them frozen. Again, you know, being careful of choking hazards with small things, but aside from that, you know, you can make them into smoothies, make them into sorbets as well. So if you've got a food processor, my kids love, at the end of the day, they're like, Mum, can we have pudding? It's like, more pudding, always pudding. I will literally go and get, you know, hands full of, either it could just be banana to make banana ice cream, and they know what it is, they know it's fruit, but, you know, berries and things, if you just put them in a food processor with a little bit of water, you can make a sort of, like a sorbet, which is really tasty. It's just a different way to eat them, but also just eating them frozen. So raspberries, if you haven't tried frozen raspberries, I can thoroughly recommend it. Really nice. And frozen grapes too. Yeah. Any other questions?
How long does it take to defrost milk when it's like that? Because I haven't done it yet. We went away, I had to shove 2 pints in the freezer, got it out. It's taken 2 days to defrost. I was like, I need to do that next time.
Yeah. If you put it in a dish of cold water, if it was frozen about that size, it'd be about 10-15 minutes. Yeah. It very much depends on, you know, how thick it is and everything. I have done it before where I poured more than I should have in the bag, and then came to defrost it for the kids' breakfast, and it was like, okay, kids, you're having porridge today because this is not completely defrosted yet. But yeah, you can get it to that point where it's at least usable. But flat freezing, I find as well, it doesn't tend to separate as much when you flat freeze it. I have no idea what the science is behind it.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, dairy products, sort of things like cream and milk, have a tendency to separate. So the fats will separate from the water. It's not spoilt, it's literally just that separation. So if you give it a good shake or a good stir, it should come back together. But for some reason, when I flat freeze it, it never separates. So
What about
worth a try.
raw meat? Lots of people are worried about what to do with raw meat once it's frozen.
Yeah, so
How to cook it.
Yeah, I used to be really, really guilty of putting raw meat into the freezer, and then it would just never come out again because I wasn't organised enough to actually defrost it in time. I was very nervous of the defrosting. There are 3 safe ways to defrost meat. In the fridge, if you are an organised person and can leave it overnight for sort of a day or so. If, like me, you are not organised, then in a dish of cold water will help to speed up the process but keep the temperature low so bad bacteria can't develop. You don't want to be defrosting at room temperature because you're going to encourage bacteria to develop. And then the third way is microwaving it on the defrost setting as long as you then cook it immediately. It's really important that it's cooked immediately because once you bring it into the danger zone where bad bacteria is going to develop, you need to be getting it up past out of that zone and into the kind of cooking phase, basically. It's also really handy to know, I think, that if you've got raw products that are in the freezer and you cook with them, it's absolutely fine for you to then freeze what you've cooked. So if you've got some frozen onions, frozen beef mince or whatever, frozen veggies, and you cook up a bolognese or something and you've got too much, it's absolutely fine for you to then freeze those leftovers because they've been cooked. If you just defrosted the beef mince and you decided you didn't want it, you wouldn't be able to just put it back in the freezer. You need to cook it to reduce any risk from bacteria that's developed. But you could just cook the beef mince and get it back in the freezer if you couldn't face cooking the full meal you were planning to cook. So it's a handy one to have up your sleeve just in case.
So you said you can refreeze fresh meat that you've cooked, and then if you get frozen meat, you cook it, you can refreeze it again.
Yes, absolutely. So
I don't think you could do that.
yeah, as long as it's been cooked. And it's important though as well that you're not reheating more than once. So when you freeze whatever it is you've cooked, freeze it in usable portions. Freeze it so, if you've got it in slices or an open freezing, pieces of chicken that are cooked, so that when you want to use them, if you just want to add a handful of pieces to a pasta dish or a risotto or something, you need to make sure it's absolutely piping hot before you serve it. So it's a really good investment to get a food probe thermometer. They don't have to be expensive. But a food probe thermometer will let you know that it's at a safe temperature. All the information is on the Food Standards Agency's website for temperatures and timings. It is also in my book, but you can get it online. And that can give you the confidence that it's fine, but it's just that thing of just being able to reheat as much as you need, because once you've reheated it, you shouldn't be cooling and reheating it multiple times. Okay. Any other questions? We okay for...
Yeah, we're okay for time. I think the only other thing might be worth discussing is rice.
We can touch on rice. I think we did touch on rice last time.
Yes,
so rice is a really high-risk food, but it is absolutely fine to freeze it. So if you cook too much rice, the key thing is that you cool it quickly. So if it's just plain rice, it can just be run under the cold tap. Spread it out rather than freezing it in a block. Again, thinking about that thing of how much am I going to want to use and only being able to reheat a certain amount of it, so what you're going to eat. If you spread it out in a thin layer on a lined tray, then you're going to be able to just break off as much as you want when you want it. So rather than having to guess how much am I actually going to want to eat and portioning it up, if you do that, you've got that flexibility there that you can just heat up a little bit. So I tend to use that for things like the kids' dinners, but also for me, if I want to have something and I just want a little bit of rice on the side, and that can just be reheated from frozen, as long as you make sure it is absolutely piping hot. It is really important with rice, should be cooled and into the fridge or freezer within an hour. And when you reheat it, again, absolutely piping hot. Don't leave it to defrost on the side or anything like that. It is a dangerous food, but it is a handy one if you can get confident with doing it. It's really useful to have.
Another way, because I'm too lazy to spread it out and wait for it and everything, so I just put it in the sieve, put it under the tap. In seconds, it's cold, and then you can freeze it that way as well.
Yeah, and if you're cooling things down, so like with rice, if you've got a risotto, for example, that you couldn't run under the tap, just spreading it out so that the heat can escape, and making sure as well that you don't put any hot food into the fridge or into the freezer. If you do that, you're just going to raise the temperature of the fridge or freezer and put other food at risk. And if you put something like rice in the freezer as well, you're going to find that although it might be cold on the outside, it's still going to be warm in the middle. So you're going to have bad bacteria developing in the middle of the rice, which could make you really, really sick. So you want to make sure you're stirring it and getting it into the fridge pretty promptly or into the freezer.
Amazing, thank you. I did spot on the table of one thing that you can't freeze, and it was the wrong one, but it was spinach. And I'm interested to see how you freeze your spinach. Because do you cook it first and then freeze it, or do you freeze it?
I usually freeze it as it is, and that's essentially just a preference thing, but I would just give it a good wash and then either pop it in a freezer bag. Sometimes I spread it out, but usually I just pop it into a freezer bag because it tends to break up anyway. And I then just use that in cooking, so things like risottos, curries, or adding it to smoothies straight from the freezer. So again, no defrosting necessary.
Well, thank you so much. It's been
Pleasure.
a wealth of information and certainly changed my freezer habits anyway.
And if anyone has any more questions or anything, as I say, we're over on the Bexley stall, so you're very welcome to come and have a chat and have a nosy in the books and see. There's over 700 foods that you can freeze listed in the books, so if you want to have a look, very welcome to.